Alcibiades and Athenian performance culture. I'm not actually really talking about athletics at all. I'm talking about horses, horse rearing, chariot racing. I'm talking about athletics, I'm talking about the Olympics. So various Olympics. That's Alcibiades there. Elon Musk, Donald Trump, Boris Johnson and Jack Locke at Beijing 2008. I'm not going to be talking about many of those directly, but you might like to think with them as we're going along. So, jumping the shark in 416 BC? Question mark. Make of Alcibiades is the basic question that I'm going to be exploring across this talk through a variety of material. So, hopefully by now, you've all got this idea that the Greeks were incredibly competitive people. In the history of their culture, in the history of their literature, they're writing about themselves. Right from the very start in Homer's Iliad, we have this idea of competitiveness, trying to excel, trying to be the best. There's something built into the very idea of the relationship between individuals and groups in ancient Greek culture from as far back as we can go. And I'm going to be talking about late 5th century BC, Athens and Olympia, but bearing this in mind is a fundamental co-matrix to the whole thing. So, I'm going to be talking about specific details on 5th century competition, success and celebration. So I'll mention Pinmar again, you'll have heard about him earlier. I'm going to be focusing on the relation between individuals' wealth and Athens as a democracy, asking bigger questions, centering around Alcibiades, this one might figure from late 5th century Athens, politics and culture. I'm thinking about the sources. Now, how do we know anything about Alcibiades? What do we make of it? So, Athenian rhetoric, Athenian material culture, to think about what we learned from 4 and 6. And I think rhetoric I include actually historiography, because Thucydides, the great Greek historian, has a big role here as well. Rhetoric also includes kind of sort of poetry, because there's a bit of poetry here that is also relevant for this topic. So what do we learn from the 4 and 6 Olympics? What do we think about the Olympics in 4 and 6? What do we think about Alcibiades? What do we think about the relationship between sport and politics in this particular period? Are we looking backwards? Thinking about jumping the shark makes you think that Alcibiades is an extreme throwback, a bit desperate, or are there continuities toward what happens after, what comes later? So I'll be exploring a little bit some of these big questions. So just some further sort of introductory matrices. So Olympia, site of various contests, performances, sporting events from like Greek myth right through into the period I'm talking about, but right on through the Hellenistic period into the Roman period. Emperors turn up and perform in chariot racing, for instance. And this gets talked about throughout antiquity right through to 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. I think Zara's going to be talking maybe a little bit about some of that sort of thing later on. You've also heard about Delphi, I think, from Xavier earlier. I don't have a picture of, I could put more pictures of more places where people competed and did athletics and sport and loads of other things in international, as it were, or pan-Hellenic or more widely Greek festivals outside of their city spaces. But I'm also going to be talking a little bit about Athens itself and Athens' own spaces, especially towards the end of my lecture, for reasons which will become clearer. So that's the Theatre of Dionysus, where all the big dramatic festivals and contests, most of the big dramatic competitions and other competitions in culture, a lot of them anyway, happened throughout the period I'm talking about. So, what I'm going to do is, first of all, introduce you to these key terms which I'm going to be talking about, implicitly talking about throughout, and then move on to a timeline, and interspersing my timeline with the evidence that pertains to Alcibiades and his family before moving on to talking about material culture at the end of the lecture. So the monuments that we have still extant, or the evidence we have for monuments that existed in Athens at the time. So mostly the evidence I'm talking about focuses on what's called the Tethrypon, the four-horse chariot team, main event at the Olympic Games in the 5th century BC and afterwards was the four-horse chariot race. We can think of it in terms of, like, I think the best modern analogy for thinking about this is like Formula One, or something even more extreme than that, like SpaceX, right? Absolutely huge amounts of cash being thrown at this event, right? To the greater glory of what? The state? An individual? Olympia? What? What do we talk about? How do we deal with horse racing in antiquity? In 5th century Greece especially, is actually really fascinating, not because anybody expects us to be interested in horses particularly, but what horses come to signify, what work they do. Why this is important is because this is related to, but acts in sort of contrast with other things going on elsewhere. So in Athens, we have a system after the reforms of Cleisthenes, the birth of democracy as we kind of like to think of it in 5th century Athens terms, we have a system called the system of liturgies, where wealthy individuals, according to various property classes and so forth, or are forced to use their wealth, their private wealth, for public service. So fitting out a trierarchy, for instance, is one of them. But the ones that are particularly important today, especially, is the choregos, the choregia, the way in which Athens as a democracy organizes its choral festivals. So in order to have individual choruses perform, they need a private sponsor to provide the funds, the hosting of the training, and all the rest of it that people need, citizens need, in order to perform in the Athenian democracy. It's not solely an Athenian invention, the choregia. It's widespread around Greece, but it's best known from Athens because the evidence is mostly not just literary, but epigraphic in the terms of the inscriptions that the Athenians wrote about themselves as part of what it meant to be a democratic body. And a lot of the inscriptions are choregic inscriptions, talking about who won in a particular year. Another liturgical kind of duty was architheoros, which is the person who funds the democratic state pilgrimage to places like Olympia, or Delos, or Delphi, or Izmir, or wherever. And what's interesting, I think, what I'm going to be talking about a little bit in detail, is the extent to which these liturgical structures, that are democratic ones, fit alongside, but also rub against and cause friction with, and indeed, in Alcibiades' case, directly clash with, chariot racing. The idea that an Athenian could go to Olympia and race chariots. And as we'll see, how extraordinary, not just that Alcibiades raced chariots was odd for an Athenian, it's not particularly odd, but the way he did it seems pretty extraordinary. And then at the end I'm going to be talking a little bit about choregic monuments in Athens. The monuments that we know that these choregoi erected to celebrate the successes that the people they were sponsoring achieved. And we'll be exploring the extent to which the history of choregic monuments in Athens actually looks a bit like the same kind of tensions that I'm exploring with Alcibiades in Olympia. There are a range of questions and interesting kind of conundrums to ask about these interconnections that ancient historians, cultural historians are interested in, because they speak to much bigger questions about what even is democracy. How do we characterize that? Does it stay the same? Does it change? What pressures are put upon it. Okay, so timeline. It's going to start before 806 BC, when Megacles, who's Alcibiades' maternal grandfather, was ostracized, so he'd offended the Athenian democracy and was pushed out of Athens, exiled for a period, and had his wealth confiscated, his wealth in Athens confiscated. But he goes off to outside of Athens and is then victorious in the four-horse chariot race, Tethybon, at Delphi in that year. And that victory is celebrated in a poem by Pindar. We'll see the opening of that in a second. Alcibiades is born in 451, we think. And then 448 to 420, thinking about Olympics, Sparta is dominant. Big city-state Sparta is enemy of Athens, pretty much, rival of Athens at least, is dominant in the Tethybon Olympic Games through this period. Every 4 years, the Olympic victors are Spartan. Okay, that might not. Athenians might think that's fine, right? So Spartans can do what they want. That's not about Athenian democracy at all, so fine. Should we be bothered about that? Maybe we shouldn't. Then fourth we on to 404, Peloponnesian War. Okay, it's a big problem. As you'll notice, 416 is right in the middle of this period, that period of war. How does war affect anything here? That's another question that's worth asking. Okay, so Pythian 7, the opening 10 lines of this poem, for Megacles of Athens, when he wasn't really an Athenian, because he'd been ostracized, celebrates the greatness of Athens to produce a family as great as the Alcmenids. The Alcmenids, this historically hugely wealthy, aristocratic, well-networked family, of which Heracles, the Athenian statesman, but also obviously Alcibiades is a member. Already here we have this tension in this text between thinking about Athens as glorified and the family and particular success of Megacles in this case being emphasized. How do we deal with that? What does that tell us about Athens? Is this a particularly good story to tell about Athenian democracy? Maybe not. I'll come back to that question throughout, because that question is something that will be with us through the rest of this entire talk. So that's kind of a backstop. This is looking back from Alcibiades' position in 416, looking back to these kind of family glories. Athens also, in a sense, looking back to these family glories, the time of Pindar, when Pindar was writing poems for the Athenian democracy, as well as writing poems for people like Megacles. Okay, so moving on, timeline-wise. 41 to 414 is the so-called Peace of Nicias, which is like a Cold War, where the Athenian statesman Nicias organises a cessation of hostilities. So the sense of the Peloponnesian War is sort of in two halves. And again, as we'll see, Alcibiades in 4 and 6 is bang in the middle of this. Okay. So a Cold War, because so formal hostilities were kind of supposed to be kind of in a truce, but the extent to which the Peace of Nicias was actually any peace at all is satirized massively in, for instance, Aristophanes, who wrote an entire play about it called Peace. So it's a bit of a moot point. As you know, the Cold War is, or indeed our contemporary relations with Russia might be. Okay, to what extent are we at peace with Russia right now is a good question to ask. I'm making these gestures as I go along, not just because I'm kind of adding a bit of kind of fluff to a kind of a classical lecture, but because the kinds of questions you can ask of this material actually resonate and become important, and the kinds of things you think about now, about the world you live in now, can help you think about the kinds of ways you might interpret the evidence you're presented with from antiquity to make sense of that dynamic. This isn't just a story about Alcibiades. It's a story about bigger questions about the relationship, what we think democracy is even today, right? It's the same deal, so that's why I had Trump, Elon Musk and Boris on my slide at the beginning, sort of hidden in the background. So 420 BC, Sparta was still banned. It was banned from competing in the Olympics at this time because of the war and the way in which the geopolitics of the control of the sanctuary Olympia manifested itself. But the Spartans still managed to be victorious in the Tethrypon in 420 because he entered as a private citizen and borrowed somebody else's state's chariot. Right, so he nicked the Boeotians' chariot, the thieves in that place, and competed and he won like that. So Sparta still won in 420. So then we have 416 with Alcibiades. Alcibiades enters 7 teams in the Olympic Tethrypon and comes first, second and third, according to Euripides, the poem that he wrote to celebrate this success allegedly, or first, second and fourth, which is what Thucydides says. And so there were various attendant celebrations. So allegedly Euripides wrote a victory to celebrate this event. As we'll see, there were also various other things that happened at the Olympics of 416 which come subject of controversy. Entering 7 4-horse chariot teams, it's like owning 7 Formula 1 teams or 7 SpaceX ventures. Like, what is going on? Right. How extreme is this? How do we understand this? What is going on? How do we characterize this behavior? It's a crux, which as we'll see, we'll have various possible solutions to, which raise various further questions. Okay, so query 4 and 5. Some more evidence rocks up. So there's a piece of Athenian forensic rhetoric called Alcibiades 4 against Alcibiades, which isn't really by Alcibiades because the dates don't fit, but it's collected in his collected speeches, which is an Athenian private prosecution attacking Alcibiades for his public and private failing, including his dealings at Olympia, which railroaded and trod on some other people's heads, allegedly. Okay? So this is what we have of Euripides' victory ode. So as we'll see later, this only survives in quotation by Plutarch, writing in the 2nd century AD. So the extent to which this is genuine Euripides is difficult to determine. Some scholars, including the original kind of writers about this fragment, think it is genuine. Other scholars are more circumspect. It's full of the kinds of things you would expect a victory ode to do, to celebrate someone like Alcibiades, although it does kind of do odd things too, like talking about a lack of effort, achieving his success effortlessly, which is slightly kind of running directly in the face of any of the other evidence, right? So this is an interesting text. Another possible line reconstructed by Maurice Barrow, who wrote the first article about this piece, reconstructed from another text by Plutarch in the 2nd century AD, has this line: "For a happy man it is necessary in the first place to have a city of noble renown." That's interesting because that reminds you of the starting point of the Megacles poem the poem from Megacles, Pythian 7, which says you have first a solid foundation in Athens. And this is a trope across a range of these kinds of texts. You need a solid city base, you're glorifying the city, but you're also emphasizing this individual. His effortless success, extraordinary. Just another extraordinary text. Extraordinary in various ways, especially because we're not even sure that this is even by Euripides. Not even sure it's genuine. Was it even written at the time? We don't even know that. Okay. So bits of Alcibiades 4 against Alcibiades. 2 sections from the speech. Bits which speak directly to Alcibiades' behaviour at the Olympics, which may well be, but aren't specified as being 4 and 6. A recent article has argued this is directly about 4 and 6. Seems a fairly good argument to say that this is about 4 and 6. So, what happens in that first paragraph in 29 is that Alcibiades organizes his own kind of sacred procession and sacrifice using the Athenians' own vessels and trappings of sacrifice and borrowing them directly from the Athenian aristocrats who are the liturgists for this event at the time, the Architheoroi. Right? And Alcibiades, this is outrageous. It's totally outrageous. Hubris, though. Right? Alcibiades is characterized by hubris. Right? He's an insolent, outrageous, violent figure, which lots of other contemporary texts riff off, actually. And then, and people are confused. They think Alcibiades is lending the Athenian state the sacred vessels because he's more important and prominent than they are. Pretty extraordinary claim to use, but also a statement about the kinds of things you could think Olympia was used to. This other thing, in section 30, Alcibiades, the people of Ephesus, erected a Persian pavilion twice as large as that of our official delegation, the Plausiantes Demosias in the original Greek. So basically, you have to think of Olympia, ancient Olympia, is a bit like Glastonbury, with loads of tents and loads of kind of, delegations. Harry Potter bit, there's all those people coming turning up for whatever it is, the international Quidditch games in those tents. And Alcibiades has the biggest tent. Right? And he has other people from somewhere else fund it for him. And it's supposedly twice as big as the Persian pavilion. Okay, so again, there's confusion about who is more prominent, who is using Olympia for what is the purpose of turning up at Olympia at all. Okay. Well, this is rhetoric. We don't necessarily believe all of this stuff, right? We don't necessarily understand. This is not clear evidence for what actually happened in 4 and 6, because this could be a vicious litigation. It could be someone organising a private prosecution for personal gain. The speaker of this text, the person who Alcibiades is writing for, might be just as kind of untruthful and sly as Alcibiades himself is. We don't believe the evidence we always get about popular spaces, do we? Okay? So who knows? How do we deal with rhetorical evidence? Good question. Moving on. Last year's the 5th century BC, Thucydides. History of the Peloponnesian War, including detailed account of Alcibiades' role in the imperial demise of Athens because of the Duke Sicilian expedition, and again I'll talk about that in a minute with some more detail. 404 BC, Alcibiades is murdered in Phrygia. At the end of the Peloponnesian War, Alcibiades is murdered probably at Spartan bidding. He's murdered with the help of the Persians as well, because of the various plots, the various people he's peed off in the last 10 years of his life, basically, including the Athenians and the Spartans and the Persians. 397 BC, we have another speech, a defense speech this time by Alcibiades' son, also named Alcibiades, Donald Jr., right? Defending his father's posthumous reputation against claims from a prosecutor seeking 5 talents compensation for his unpaid role in a 4 and 6 success. So the 5 talents is what it might cost to fund one chariot team, and he had 7, right? And we have to think about how much that is. So we have a rough idea that the wealthiest person in Greece, who incidentally Alcibiades was married into, family of, had a wealth estimated at 200 talents. Imagine the richest person in the world, and then divide how much money it costs to fund this kind of event with that amount of private wealth, and you get the sense of this being a really big deal. Okay, so this is the two crucial chapters of Thucydides for thinking about Alcibiades. The first is Alcibiades, this little potted biography of Thucydides' little potted biography of Alcibiades. He was very much in the public eye, and his enthusiasm for hypotrophia, horse breeding and other extravagances went well beyond what his fortune could supply. So Thucydides is claiming that Alcibiades didn't actually have all the cash, he had to borrow it from elsewhere. Well, what does that mean is another question, right? We'll look into that in a little bit. This is actually a devastating critique of Athens, not actually just of Alcibiades, this whole passage. The Athenians developed hostility towards him as an aspiring tyrant, opposed to Angelos epithumunti polemioi kathistasan, and things go really downhill, right? So although in a public capacity he was excellent, his way of life made him objectionable to everyone as a person, so they handed over their affairs to other people and went downhill. So be careful what you wish for in politics. Interestingly, Alcibiades then is given a speech in this debate about the Sicilian expedition, which is ultimately doomed, about why Alcibiades thinks it's a good idea. And his success in the Olympic Games is the directly most prominent aspect of this speech. We need to think carefully about the rhetoric here, not simply because we might think, well, this is what Alcibiades really thought, but because why is Thucydides, historian, spinning it this way? What's at stake in the claims that Thucydides is having Alcibiades make here about his splendid show at the Olympic Games? Bearing in mind that, as Simon Hallblower thinks is a world expert of Thucydides is out to correct the claim made in the victory that Alcibiades came first, second, and third. He has Alcibiades say he came first, second, and fourth. We don't know who came third, by the way, but anyway. And this is an interesting passage because it mixes not only that Olympic glory with Alcibiades, but also the relation between Alcibiades and Olympia with Alcibiades and his democratic liturgies. Right? Though it is quite natural, this is the second half of the passage, for my fellow citizens to envy me for the magnificence with which I have done things in Athens, such as providing choruses and so on, so his choregiae, yet to the outside world this also is evidence of our strength. Indeed, it is no useless folly, eukathestos anoia, like really bizarre loaded litotes, double negative, no useless folly, when a man should spend his own money, not only to benefit himself, but his city as well. Right? This is a kind of a critique or a test to destruction of the liturgical system, right? With Alcibiades as his focus. Can read Thucydides as offering a kind of critique of how well that system works. Because Thucydides is actually critiquing the very idea of democracy as sustaining Athens properly in this period with further resonance. Elon Musk. So, further questions. So Elon Musk spent $100 million of his own personal wealth to fund SpaceX at the start. A much smaller fraction of his wealth than Alcibiades' outlay, although Thucydides tells us that he didn't have the whole lot of cash himself anyway. Okay. So how do we understand, how do we explain, how do we model the way in which Alcibiades received the cash from elsewhere? Do we think about it in terms of, private, personal, individual biography in the way that traditional historiography writes Alcibiades up as, on the model of, Plutarch, Life of Alcibiades? Or are there bigger issues? Is it just about all the mates around the Greek world Alcibiades has? Is it about his family ties? Is it about corporate finance? Is it about economics? Is it about religion? All these other factors that might come into play to help us try to model what this means. It's not simply about Alcibiades as an individual getting on with loads of people. And that's the reason why I bring in Elon Musk as a point of comparison. Because you can use the contemporary question about what Elon Musk represents for American democracy or for democracy at all. We'll think about what international corporate governance looks like, to actually think about what democracy means today. So not just using this as an opportunity to model what we think ancient democracy looks like, but thinking about the evidence of ancient democracy to then bring it into our own modern spaces and think about the resonance in both directions for helping us to understand both better. What does Elon Musk use of private and corporate wealth to fund NASA, which is what he's currently doing, tell us about American democracy? Is that something we're comfortable with or not? Is that something that's anti-democratic or not? The fact that this is a discussion is evidenced by and magnified by the fact that it's a discussion already in those 5th and 4th century sources that we just looked at. Okay. So, next bit of text. This is Isocrates 16 concerning the team of forces, whereas this Alcibiades, his son, in the 4th century, looking back on 4 and 6, again spinning the corporate nature of Alcibiades' successor, Olympia, and trying to make good with, but you feel the tension in this speech, and how well is Alcibiades' son managing to pull this claim off? Right? Is he just repeating the same tropes that Alcibiades and Euripides and Thucydides has already critiqued, or not? So I think this is an awkward bit of text, right? Because you feel like, well, loads of people have critiqued this already, but we still want to hold out for the legitimacy of doing these Athenian democratic functions anyway. So talking about my father's service in Athens as a choregos and gymnasiarch and trioarch, but also talking about his prestige in the Olympic Games, which redound to the prestige of Athens in the eyes of his fellow citizens. What to do with Alcibiades is a kind of topos of late 5th century and early 4th century Athenian democratic discourse, and Aristophanes frogs famously at the end, but in other texts throughout the period, and looked back on actually by Plato in the latter sections of the Symposium, which is maybe a few decades after this text, maybe. Okay, back to my timeline. So here we have Plutarch rocking up in the 2nd century AD, writing a life of Alcibiades, which repeats some of the information we already have from our sources and provides the fragment of Alcibiades of the Euripides poem. So there's that evidence all presented. And what's interesting about this text is the way in which Plutarch is looking back over 700 years of subsequent history to try to figure out how to pitch Alcibiades as an individual. So no one else ever entered 7 of these Olympic Games, neither commoner nor king, neither private citizen, idiotes in the Greek, nor king Basileus. What am I going to translate king Basileus? We translate that in Greek as king normally, but it could be an emperor, some big Roman emperors, the Hellenistic dynasts, all kinds of people between 2nd century AD and 4 and 6. And somehow Alcibiades had managed to do something that no one else ever did, including people with that kind of power and backing. So we have more detail about who, city-states providing Alcibiades with equipment and stuff. What do we think about those relations? What do we feel about how those city-states felt about providing Alcibiades with this stuff? Is that true? Right? Is it really the case that those city-states were happy to give that? Is that shorthand for something else? Is that shorthand for the way in which people associated with those city-states had corporate wealth through their own family businesses and so forth that allowed this to happen. Okay. So Plutarch is summing up the evidence and sort of giving us further questions to think about. Okay, so now that's all the textual material done. I'm now going to kind of give you a whistle-stop tour through some other problems by thinking about material culture and creating monuments. Okay. There we go. This is a map of Athens with the Acropolis in the middle there. And that circle there in red, along that street marked out in black, is a street that links, it's a street of tripods. It's a street that links the Athenian Agora on the north side of the Acropolis with the Theatre of Dionysus down there in the central bottom. And along that street, victors in the choral contests in Athens, or the performance contests in Athens at the city Dionysia, were able to erect their tripod that they won from the city to celebrate and to glorify the material fabric of Athens and to celebrate and memorialize their success. Okay, and we have evidence, direct evidence, for some of these still extant, and the one circled in red is a creating monument of Alcibiades. Here we have some more highlighted in red. So the one at the top is the creating monument of Thessalus. The one on the far left is the creating monument of Nicias, a different Nicias from the 4th century. And that ring on the right-hand side is the beginning of the Street of Tripods, as you can see, with creating monuments beginning there. And you can see that some of these look pretty big, pretty large. That's interesting too. So here's the creating monument of Alcibiades. This is a very prominent place that everyone's been to. Athens, a nice cafe in the corner, so you can sit there in the square and contemplate this thing. That's one reconstruction of how it might have looked. So there's a tripod on the top, this kind of talismanic kind of thing that comes from Homer as something that people competed for from the very beginning of the idea of Greek culture and competitiveness. That becomes a kind of a token of what Athens becomes famous for in its history of choral competitions. People vied for democratic success to win these monuments, to win these cauldrons, basically, that they could build monuments to put them inside. And you can see how there is a tension already, just by looking at this picture, between the tripod itself, which you might not notice, which is the thing that they won, and the building built to house it. That's very prominent in this case. These are importantly, these are 4th century monuments. So we've moved on in time, like 50 years, into a different period of Athenian history. After the fall of Athens in the Peloponnesian War, we're now in the period of the rise of Macedon, Philip II, for instance, and much bigger impingements, external impingements on democracy, on Athens as an idea from outside, because of geopolitics happening that Athens has no real control over. But they're still doing these choral performances and erecting these monuments to talk about democracy. Okay, so there is that square cavern is the great monument of Thessalus, was still extant. It was turned into a church in later antiquity. It survived fully extant until, I think, 1811, somewhere around that, when it was blown up by the Turks, I think, or something like that, during the Greek War of Independence. And a couple of pillars above it, which also are creating monuments, used to have tripods on the top of those as well. There is one reconstruction of the created monument of Thessalus from 319 BC, with possibly, in its original configuration, a tripod on the outside on the top. And it has an inscription on the entablature telling you what the victory was for and what this monument is celebrating. We have no idea what this actual building was used for, whether you could go in it, what was inside at all, right? But it's looking a bit more like a temple, maybe. And then, sort of jumping the shark again, the creating monument of Nicias, which is basically a temple for the tripod. Right? Actually, you can't really put the tripod on the roof of this. It doesn't look like it fits. The evidence doesn't seem to support the idea that the tripod was displayed on the outside. Again, it has an inscription on it, and the inscription is extant. There's the inscriptional detail. And this celebrates Nicias in a way that emphasizes the Nike aspect of his name, which means victory, emphasizing him as the victorious Choregos, rather than it being the tribe who was successful and he was just funding their success. This makes Nicias himself the victor in a way that feels a bit more like, again, a bit like something Alcibiades might have done. Do we have any choregic monuments for Alcibiades as choregi? No, we don't, which would be fascinating if we did. But that would change the dynamic, the history of this period a little bit, I think. But it's important to recognise that this kind of thing is happening in the late 4th century, when Athens is now under the sway of Macedon. It's an oligarchic polis now, but it's still buying into the idea of democracy. Oligarchy means it's being run by a small clique of politicians who are imposed from maybe under the instigation of Macedon. It's not really a democracy in the way that the classic reforms, and the contests that are manifested that are still happening still seem to suggest. Is Athens a democracy in 2019? Good question. Maybe not, but it's at least giving you the idea that it might still be a little bit. Okay. So, what do we do with all the evidence we've got here? I'm going to finish a couple of slides here. What do we do with Alcibiades? How do we make sense of all of that evidence? Do we think Alcibiades is jumping the shark in 416 with his 7 entries in the Olympic Tethrippon? How do we characterise that? What broader ideas can we bring? So, sport has always been political, obviously. Right? The idea that the Greeks, were this virtuous place where everyone was competing on an equal footing and it's like garbage. Right? Sport has always been political, and you go back to Greece and find it in its gory details. Olympia is a cultural centre whose use and appropriation by states and individuals throughout history is political history as well as cultural history. You can't think of sport and the Olympic Games without thinking about politics. Loads of, this always comes up every time there's an Olympic Games, so we've got to keep sport, we've got to keep politics out of the Olympics. Like, everyone knows that even by saying that, you're making a political gesture. The place of sport celebration in the history of democracy, Athenian democracy, including public and private wealth and corporate finance maybe, is itself an ongoingly fascinating and controversial subject for politics as well as culture. Again, Elon Musk is the obvious example, right? Elon Musk buying Twitter, what does that mean? How do you feel about your cultural selves as democratic subjects if that's happening? Do you care? Maybe you don't, but it might matter for some people. How we Tacitus figure out how to understand this, all of this, is complicated and requires not just a facility with particular bits of evidence, but a load of different evidence, and a load of different outlooks, and a load of different aspects of thinking about time and chronology. Okay. Are there any questions? To what extent do we think Alcibiades jumped the shark in 416? Is there a sense in which, as such, Alcibiades at Olympia is a desperate and indeed anti-democratic throwback, looking like Megacles, maybe? From whose perspective? With what implications? And or to what extent do we think these 4 and 6 Olympics were simply a symptom of contemporary realities as well as a harbinger of things to come? So both of those are possible ways of thinking. How do we contextualize? I think the answer is a bit of both of those ways. Backward looking, but also forward looking. Actually, that's the way I like to think about classics too, so that's nice. So, a balance or intersection between the prominence of personal narratives and motivations, as demonstrated in all the textual sources here, and in more traditional narrative accounts within modern historiography. What story shall we talk about Alcibiades? No, how shall we write about Alcibiades today? Right? What biography to write of him? And broader structures and dynamics. So incremental changes within a first democracy as a social structure, thinking about contemporary America, for instance. How, as it were, anthropologically, how thick a description do we need for ancient Greek democracy in order to figure this out? How much do we understand even what American democracy is today? Is actually quite a complicated thing too, even as we have, far more evidence than we have for ancient Greek democracy. Geopolitical context is crucial as well. It might be that Alcibiades might not have done what he did in 416 if the Peloponnesian War hadn't happened. So that some people have argued that the point with Sparta having all of that success in the years before, from the mid-century onwards, is a motivational factor for Alcibiades in 416. But there are bigger things also that are worth thinking about here, so economic history. So changes in sources of wealth. Mining, for instance, in the case of Hippolytus, the wealthiest man in Greek at the time, there's a miner who basically ran loads of slave colonies, producing wealth for himself and his own family, but to the greater glory of maybe Apollos. Okay. And the importance of the long view. So it's not satisfactory simply to focus on 4 and 6 and looking backwards, but also on those potential continuities into the 4th century, which the materials culture is actually useful for. And also looking with Plutarch, not just saying, well, Plutarch 700 years after the fact, so he doesn't know anything, he's just making it up or just copying together all the sources he had. But his longer view might also be relevant too, because he knows about what basileis are for him. And he understands emperors. He understands Hellenistic dynasts. He understands politics in a much more kind of layered way than those 5th century and 4th century sources and bits of evidence do. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, I think we've probably got time for one question while we swap over. And again, get scribbling on your feedback if you can. Any questions?
Yes?
Okay, so when I look at modern day sort of the economy under capitalism and stuff like that, and the wealth gap, I think of like bourgeoisie, proletariat and class consciousness, where the wealth gap is kind of a struggle between people who have so much money to spend on ridiculous things and people who are struggling to feed their families. In this situation, the proletariat, they're illiterate, they don't really look into it, so did regular people care? And if not, did those scholars that condemned Alcibiades' actions, what did they care about? Did they think it was an attack on democracy, or what was their issue?
That's a really interesting question, thank you very much. The answer to that will be complicated by the extent to which we can look at ancient Greek economics and politics through that kind of, as it were, Marxist filter that you're actually talking about. And so it's in the sense of, is it anachronistic, as it were, to apply? Is it out of place for me to apply an idea about capitalism to a period in antiquity where capitalism didn't even exist? Is one aspect of your question. The answer to that would be, I don't really care, because of the suggestiveness, the resonance of the interconnections. I think Marxism and capitalism are models for how we understand economics, and antiquity is a model for how we understand the contemporary world too. So, and think about them the two together. To what extent do people care? Well, that is interesting in terms of the way in which, so the emphasis I put on here is that the evidence is complicated because there's no straight way to read off from forensic rhetoric. What people say in courts of law doesn't necessarily directly relate to what is true, even when you're under oath, for instance. I suppose the fact that the evidence here would be me going back to and talking about Greek comedy, for instance, Athenian comedy and Aristophanes. And the big question at the end of the Frogs, which I didn't talk about today, could have done, I suppose, is what to do with Alcibiades at the end of the Peloponnesian War. Should we bring him back into Athens or not? How do we deal with him? So the fact that, the most popular art form in a period is asking the question about what to do with Alcibiades and getting comic traction out of that issue seems to imply that Aristophanes thought that people would care about this issue. How we more generally can answer your question is to do with how we feel about the complexity of the different sources and how we respond to them. I think ultimately the evidence of Aristophanes would very much say people do care. People did care. So Aristophanes is always critiquing horse rearing in Athens, so the opening of clouds is another sort of place to go for there, which is actually sort of again a kind of implicit critique of Alcibiades at the same time, his family with all those horsey names, for instance. So people do care about it. But what you do with it, how you deal with that, how can you do anything to stop being manipulated by these wealthy individuals, is something that we don't have an answer to, but is, I think, quintessential to the very idea of what being a democratic citizen is partly about. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, David.
Thank you.